Can you hear me? Yes, I think it's working. So we're in the home stretch. I'm Dave Pattee with Deloitte. I am a director in our audit practice here in Boise, and it's my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Reed Brimhall. Reed is currently the Chief Financial Officer at Sensi. It's great to have Reed working back in Idaho again. Many of you know Reed or know of Reed. Prior to his time at Sensi, Reed was held various positions at Washington Group International and then URS Corporation, including most recently up until 2014, the Vice President and Chief Accounting Officer at URS. Prior to his time at Washington Group, Reed was also the Corporate Controller at Scientech. And also prior to that, Reed was the Senior Associate Dean for Finance and Administration at Stanford University Medical School. Reed has held many positions and various roles in his career. We could have asked Reed to speak on various topics, but he has graciously agreed to speak to us today on ethics, which benefits all of us. So thank you, Reed, and I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Dave. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, before all of that, I was an audit geek at Deloitte & Touche. Look, before I get started, I thought we ought to take a minute before the day ends and actually thank Deloitte and Boise State for rescuing our licenses once again with the end of the year CPE course. What do you think, huh? And they're more clever than you think because they saved the ethics credit for the last hour of the day, so you all had to stay the whole time, right? Most of what you've heard today have something to do with new things, changes, modifications to rules, or approaches to accounting and auditing. Ethics hasn't really changed like that. And over the years, I've participated in and taught ethics courses a number of times. I look around the room and I see a few faces who've taught ethics sections that I've attended before. And I've concluded that there's really three ways to approach this. One is I can get up here and take you through all the requirements and the rules. Or two, if we had maybe 4 hours, I know there was a session a couple days ago here at Boise State on ethics. It was a 4-hour class. We could go through some case studies. It'd be kind of difficult to do with a group this size. And the third is to talk a little bit altruistically about ethics and what does it mean and what's happened with ethics and how should we actually think about ethics. And that's what I'm going to try and do today. There is sort of a sense, I think, in our profession that ethics suddenly happened in a big bang in 2002. Anybody else here feel kind of like that? Sarbanes-Oxley, all right? There actually were a few states that required ethics training. I'm licensed in Oregon. Now, Oregon was one of those states that required ethics training clear back in the early 90s. But some of that seems to kind of have been forgotten, and it all feels like it happened all of a sudden to us when Sarbanes-Oxley happened to us. But actually, ethics is a human question that's been part of societies for millennia. So what I thought I'd do would be to try and give you a picture of how I think ethics and thinking about ethics in the business sense has changed over time. So I got a few quotes to start with. I'll start with, if this will move. Should I be pointing this a different direction? There we go. I started with one of my favorites, Mark Twain. Always do right. It will gratify some people and astonish the rest. The second quote I have from Mark Twain is actually probably a little bit more thoughtful and less sarcastic. He said, "Law controls the lesser man. Right conduct controls the greater one." And that's a comment about ethics. If everyone were truly ethical, we probably wouldn't need quite so many laws and regulations, right? So Will Rogers, some of you here are old enough to remember who Will Rogers was. He was a political columnist and commentator in the middle of the 20th century. Live in such a way that you would not be ashamed to tell your story to the town gossip. And that's a way to provide kind of a barometer about whether you're acting and living ethically. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I don't know how many of you know this. He wrote a famous Christmas carol. Anybody know? Nobody knows? I heard the bells on Christmas Day. Written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Takes less time to do a thing right than explain why you did it wrong. Ernest Hemingway. This is a quote from The Grapes of Wrath. It's only right if you feel good about it after it's over. Now, we're going to move from that era into a more modern era. So here's a U.S. Supreme Court justice. Left the Supreme Court in the early 80s. Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do. And now let's move to the SEC. 1993, Richard Breeden. It is not an adequate ethical standard to aspire to get through the day without being indicted. You sense kind of a shift here in comments and thoughts about ethics? So, 2002, we all of a sudden have the Sarbanes-Oxley. Everybody reacts to it. We spent a lot more money initially implementing standard or processes, controls, procedures to implement Sarbanes-Oxley than we all thought we would. You heard this morning from Mark Taylor about the first standard and then subsequently a later standard that was more top-down approach, all that stuff. Many of you have survived that. I'm happy that you did like I did. But by 2003 and 2004, it had become so common a topic that you began to see even political cartoons. Now, I left Washington Group in 2003 and joined URS and carried on a tradition that we had at Washington Group and held an annual conference for all of my controllers worldwide to get some CPE, but to also get together and talk about current issues, things we needed to think about, do some training on accounting standards and ethics. And the first year at URS that I did this, I asked one of my division controllers to teach the ethics section. And this is what he put up as his first slide. This is a political cartoon out of the Wall Street Journal, and you notice he managed to include me in this. And I have to admit, the guy over there at that end, except for the beard, does kind of resemble me. I agree that the numbers don't add up, but you'll notice that the letters do form words. So we'd already gotten to the point by 2004 where we were actually joking about the constant attention that had suddenly been placed on ethics. So I'm going to give you my thesis statement on ethics, and mine's probably no better than anybody else's, but this is how I think about ethics. The business environment that we operate in is complex and challenging. And it's not going to change. It's going to continue to be complex and challenging. And that's causing, and will continue to cause, a development of a wide variety of laws and regulations and a high level of scrutiny by a lot of people. Investors, regulators, and others. So, it's critical that we perform our responsibilities implying the highest ethical behavior. You heard that from Mark this morning. His comments about Arthur Andersen's view of auditing are pertinent here. The most critical ethical decision is always, the most critical ethical action is always the decision. Well, we'll talk more about decisions as we go through this. Okay, here's some facts about ethics. Everybody agree with this? We will face, not might, we will face situations in which the right answer or the ethical answer is not obvious. Anybody disagree? Okay? So we need to be conscious of the situations we're in. We need to constantly, in our responsibilities, have our eyes open, pay attention to what's going on around us, and understand the significance of the decisions that we're called upon to make, because that's what we do. Frankly, we make decisions all the time. We need to pay attention to how our decisions reflect on us, personally, on the organizations we're affiliated with, whether we're employees, owners, volunteers, whatever it is. We need to be aware of how our decisions reflect on us and others around us. And the people who are most successful in obtaining the right answer or the ethical answer understand and recognize ethical issues, seek clarity and understanding those issues, evaluate alternative solutions when ethical challenges present themselves, and make fearless decisions. Anybody ever talked about fearless decisions before? What do you think that means? Anybody? Courageous. Why, Steve?
You gotta be the guy that's going to take the hard stand and set the path for push.
Sometimes the right answer is not popular. Sometimes the right answer can have negative implications for us, our organization, and others around us. If we're not willing to make fearless decisions, we're not completely committed to acting ethically. We'll talk more about decisions as we go. Okay. What's the difference between these two? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Somebody explain what ethics means to me. Not that hard, folks. Ethics are principles, aren't they? Values, principles that guide this, again, decision making, whether or not there are policies or procedures or rules. That's what ethics means. Okay? What does compliance mean? Casey? Okay, obeying the law, following the rules, establishing structures, controls, procedures that foster adherence to laws or policies. So they're really not the same thing. One could argue that you establish controls and compliance procedures in order to be ethical. So one could also say that if you are in compliance, you're ethical. But perhaps the right way to think about it more altruistically is to say, if I'm ethical, I'm in compliance. And we should put that ethical thinking first, rather than relying on organizational policies, rules, and procedures to say, I'm okay because I obeyed the rule. We should rather say, I did the right thing, which falls underneath the rule. So I'm ethical first, and I comply afterwards. All right. Here's the first question we have today. Does being ethical mean you have to give up profits? How many say yes? Show of hands. 1. 2. Okay, how many say no? There's more of those. I threw a third one up here. Anybody say neither? A few of those too. Anybody have no idea? Well, let's explore these for a minute. Okay, here's possible answers. Yes, it means you may have to give up some profits. No, you don't have to give up being profitable. That might be kind of a different thing. It might be the wrong question. The right question might be, what's the potential impact on profitability of being unethical? Now, I'm not sure any of those answers are wrong. I think you could find situations in which all three could be true. So, yes, being ethical does mean you may have to give up some profits. You may have to resign from a client account. You may have to tell a customer, I'm not willing to do business with you anymore. Those are the kinds of things that fall under those fearless decisions, right? Not cutting corners. Being ethical may mean you have to go the extra mile. It may take longer to do the work, may cost you more. A compliance program may cost money. No, it doesn't mean you have to give up profits. You may have to give up certain kinds of profits. Being ethical has its rewards. What do you think of that one? Would you feel better about things if you made a little less money, but you felt really good about the money you made because you did it honestly and ethically? There is some reward in that, I think. And brand and reputation do matter in the marketplace. And it helps if you're ethical to win and retain top talent. Okay, the wrong question. What are the impacts? Well, there are some impacts. We heard earlier today from Mr. Park about some investigations and lawsuits related to behavior and disclosure and claims made in financial statements that may be unfounded based on results of information gathered through investigation. Fines, penalties, judgments, damage to brand and reputation, loss of customers, inability to attract and retain top talent. Okay, so all this has been going on a while, right? So once Sarbanes-Oxley was passed, have all our ethical problems gone away? Can you think of, there's been a couple examples today, so don't use those, but can you think of a situation that's been in the media lately that reflects on ethics in the business world that's gotten a lot of publicity recently? Anybody? Volkswagen. Volkswagen. Are you know, look, the automakers have actually had a rough go at this for a while. So Volkswagen has now been accused of and admitted to cheating on emissions tests. Is that unethical behavior? Yeah, I think it is. So another one that comes to mind in the auto industry is General Motors and their ignition switches, right? But it's not just those two either. I don't know how many of you know this, but between 2009 and 2012, one automaker had over twice as many involuntary recalls as any other automaker. Now, involuntary means they didn't do the recall themselves. They were forced to by the government. Anybody? You know who that was? Toyota. So we've all the major geographic manufacturers managed to get on the list of people who, or organizations who didn't really act ethically in their business practices. So it hasn't gone away, and as long as human beings are involved in making decisions, there will be some who make unethical decisions, perhaps without thinking through the process we're talking about, or perhaps simply because it suits their purpose and they don't really care very much about this, right? The lessons that have been learned from a lot of corporate missteps, it can apply to other organizations too, is that usually you get caught sooner or later. Volkswagen's a good example of that. So's General Motors. Frankly, so's Toyota in the examples. And if you go back into some of the companies' names we saw earlier today, WorldCom, Global Crossings, and Enron's always been kind of the poster child since the early 2000s, right, for exactly that kind of situation. And it can cause real damage to your business. Okay, there's an organization called the Ethics Research Center, and it conducts a national business ethics survey every 2 years. Now, I've been watching closely the last few weeks because I was afraid they'd issue their 2015 survey after I sent the slides in. And I went online last night and they haven't issued it yet. So the date is 2 years old, but it's as current as I could get. So what do you think? Has the amount of observed misconduct increased or decreased between 2011 and 2013? How many of you think it increased? Okay, does that mean everybody else thinks it decreased? How many thinks it decreased? Well, that's a minority, I think. Actually, it's decreased. So let me explain what this table says a little bit. 13% of the respondents in 2011 said that during the year they were pressured to perform some sort of compromise of ethics or misconduct. In 2013, the survey said 9%. So it's improved a little bit. I wouldn't call that gargantuan improvement, but it's improvement. Observed misconduct. Okay, how many in the survey observed some form of misconduct during the survey period in your organization? 45% in 2011 and 41% in 2013. That's the third survey in a row that it's declined, and 41% is an all-time low. I wouldn't call that admirable, but it's improving. The next one said how many were involved in or knew about reported misconduct. It went from 65% to 63%, so slight improvement. And how many experienced or knew about retaliation for having reported misconduct? 22% to 21%. So the conclusion in the survey said as follows: we believe it's probable that businesses' continuing and growing commitment to strong ethics and compliance programs is bearing fruit. Things are getting better. We're not maybe where we want to be, but we're better. Okay, next question. Which of the three do you think it plays the greatest role in reducing misconduct and the likelihood of misdeeds? And I'll acknowledge here that I think all three play some role. Which one do you think plays the greatest role? Employees fear getting caught. Wow, got no hand. One hand, okay. One, two, Russ, two, three, okay. Policies, laws, and regulations. What do you think? Okay, I got one. Feel like an auctioneer up here. All right, a strong ethics culture. Great. So let me explain this slide a little bit. On the left hand, on the vertical axis here, we have employees who observed misconduct in the previous 12 months. In the survey, they were asked to assess their organization's ethics culture. Weak, weak-leaning, strong-leaning, or strong. And then they were asked how many observed misconduct in your organization in the last 12 months. Where they concluded that their culture was weak, 88% had observed some kind of misconduct. Where they concluded it was strong, only 20%. So again, the Ethics Resource Center's conclusion: strong ethics cultures reduce both misconduct overall and the likelihood that a misdeed which does occur is a pervasive ongoing issue. So culture does count. Now let me share with you an experience I had when I joined URS. I was the controller at Washington Group. I got recruited by URS, who a few years later turned around and acquired Washington Group. But while I was being recruited, I was invited to San Francisco for an interview, and you've been through job interviews, you kind of know what it's like. After I had a nice lunch with the people I'd interviewed with in the morning, I had a meeting with the CEO. And the CEO said to me that he'd gotten feedback on my interviews and that they'd gone well, and he said, I have only one question for you. He said, what would you do if I asked you to do something that you consider to be illegal or unethical? How many of you have been asked a question like that in a job interview? Okay, a couple. Anybody over here? I'd never been asked anything like that before. But I knew right away that ethics mattered to this CEO. And I responded something to the effect that I thought the first thing I'd try and do is figure out what it was he was trying to accomplish and see if there was an appropriate and ethical way to do it. But if I concluded there wasn't, I would not participate in it, even if it meant I had to resign. And he smiled at me, stood up, stuck his hand across the desk and said, the job's yours if you want it. So I walked into a job where ethics was important. I was the chief accounting officer. I had a lot of decisions to make about financial statements, about relationships with auditors and investors and employees, about reporting on financial matters that called into question ethical decisions. And I knew from the very beginning that if a fearless decision had to be made, that CEO would back me up. And it empowered me to provide the same sort of comfort to the people who work for me. And I told them this every year at the controller conference, if you're asked to do something that makes you uncomfortable, get help. Call me. I'll do whatever I can to help you make the right decision. So culture counts. All right, so how do we go about solving ethical dilemmas, since we've concluded that we will all experience them? This is simple. You've seen all this before, so I'm not going to take a lot of time on it. Identify the dilemma, right? Pay attention. Understand that if there's a dilemma, what's the problem? What's the risk? What are the alternative actions? And not just the alternative actions, but what are the potential outcomes of those alternative actions? What are the consequences? Decide. Here we are again. Decide on the right course of action. And then implement it. And then evaluate the results of your actions. Now, I've added one more up here. As we'll go through these, you'll see it. So, okay, identify the dilemma. What's the conduct in question? What's the potential risk to the organization? How about to other people in the organization? What's the potential risk to me in the position that I have? What would Aunt Emma think? When I worked at Stanford, we were in a situation where we were in a big conflict between ourselves and the federal government about the appropriateness of our cost accounting for federally sponsored grants and contracts. And what we concluded after we did a self-examination was that we were in compliance with the Federal Acquisition Regulation and the OMB circular that applied to universities. But some of the costs that complied with the rules were kind of hard to explain. Remember that Supreme Court justice talked about the difference between what you have a right to do and what the right thing is to do? That was what we were facing. So a committee that I chaired created a fictional woman who was our Aunt Emma, and she lived in Ames, Iowa. And we would ask ourselves this question. If we tried to explain to Aunt Emma why her tax dollars were being used for this purpose, would she think that was okay or not? And if we concluded that we thought Aunt Emma would understand and approve, we would include that cost in our allocations that included allocations to government grants and contracts. If we concluded that Aunt Emma would not understand, would think it was inappropriate, we would exclude them. Aunt Emma became a legend, sort of, in the cost accounting group at Stanford. I was in contact as recently as this last summer with a couple people who still work in the FAR compliance area there, and they joked with me about Aunt Emma is still alive and well at Stanford University. And that's been over 20 years ago now. So I recommend Aunt Emma to you. She's a good barometer of ethics. All right, consider alternatives. And when I say consider alternatives, think widely about alternatives. Don't just narrow in on something because it's an easy answer. What laws, regulations, or policies are applicable? What courses of action could we take? What are the possible results? What sort of resources will it take? Is there somebody we could go get guidance from? Who should we notify? And perhaps the most challenging one, what kind of disclosures? And to whom should those disclosures be made? Decide. Here we go again. Decide on the best course of action and implement it. What's the right decision? Sometimes the right decision isn't obvious. Sometimes you may not be able to figure out what the right decision is. So you have to decide on the best decision that you can make, realizing that you may have some risk there. What resources are required and who will actually execute the actions for the right or best decision? Evaluate the results. Would you be comfortable telling that town gossip what you decided and what you did? If the media described it, would it be flattering for your organization? Have you obeyed both the letter and spirit of the law? How does Aunt Emma feel about what you decided to do and went out and did? And most importantly, how do you feel about it? This goes back to Ernest Hemingway. It's only right if you feel good about it after it's over. Why is this all so hard? Well, it's complicated. The step that requires us to decide something is always the toughest. So my recommendation to you is, it's best to decide to be ethical before an ethical problem arises. Because then you've drawn a line that says, I'm not crossing over there. Whatever the repercussions are, however fearless the decision has to be, I'm not going to cross that line. And it's easier to take that position if you've already decided that before you're presented with a dilemma. If you have to decide whether you're going to cross that line or not on the spot, when that dilemma is right there in front of you and it's really hard, it's a lot easier to compromise and step across that line. And you may find yourself somewhere you don't really want to be. All right, so what are the greatest challenges to taking an action in the face, making a decision to take an action in the face of an ethical dilemma? What would you say the biggest problem is? The biggest challenge is? Yeah?
Social implications. You know, trying to explain it or maybe how people not think it's the right thing to do.
Okay, I agree with that. People may not think it's the right thing to do. Anybody else? I think it's fear. Yeah.
Fear of being fired.
Okay, retaliation. That's the first thing on the list. Loss of employment, harassment, loss of future opportunities, threats even. But that's a fear, isn't it? What else? How about confrontations? How many of you really like confrontations? Especially with your boss, or your boss's boss, or maybe your boss's boss's boss. Anybody? It's not human nature to look forward to those kind of experiences. Those are hard. And they create fear too, don't they? So what do? Get some help. Go to somebody you can confide in that you trust, whose judgment you trust, whose ethics you trust. Get advice. Try and go within your organization first. I mean, you heard a little bit about that this morning. Give the company, give the nonprofit, give the organization a chance to understand the problem and do the right thing. Okay? If it's a person, challenge the behavior, not the person. Listen. Understand. If you can't come to a resolution and a good decision yourself, get some experts. Go to the next level of authority. All right. Let's wrap up here. At some point in your career, as we said, you will be directly involved in resolving an ethical problem. In fact, I would suggest if you take a careful evaluation of what you do for a living, you probably have this experience multiple times every week. Some may be little. And occasionally you'll run into a really big one that weighs a lot and is really hard. Remember, much of what we talked about today is frankly common sense, good judgment, and fearless decisions. Even so, the right answer isn't always clear. So we have to make the best decision we can given the circumstances we're in and the knowledge we have about alternatives. And it would probably work out best if we decide to be ethical before an ethical dilemma arises. Finally, Theodore Roosevelt. In any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The worst thing you can do is nothing. Comments or questions? Anybody?
Is doing nothing better than the wrong thing? Or worse?
I suppose that would be circumstantial. But if we're in a position of leadership and we're responsible to make decisions, we shouldn't do nothing if we know that a wrong thing's about to happen. That's not ethical either. Standing by and doing nothing's not ethical. It's one thing to make a decision that's wrong and make a mistake and have it turn out bad. It's another thing altogether to stand by and see something happen that shouldn't happen and not do anything about it. That's my personal opinion. Yes, ma'am.
Can you actually teach ethics? I mean, to me, it's ingrained in.
Well, I think all of us are taught some sort of ethical value, whether it's good, bad, strong, or weak, as we grow. I think we can make choices about ethics for ourselves and develop better judgment and willingness about being ethical. But that's a choice we have to make. That's not something that can be poured into us, right? That just happens. We have to make that decision. Yes, sir.
Well, along those lines, I think, I'm not sure, but I think it was Aristotle who said that you can act like an ethical person and you will become one. So
I like that. I like to add that. All right, thank you.